ჩვენი სტუმარია ბულგარეთის ვიცე-პრეზიდენტი და ფინანსთა მინისტრი, რომელიც პირველად არის ჩვენს უნივერსიტეტში, არის აქაც ნამყოფი და ჩვენ ასურის ერთად ჩავატარეთ ბაზარეთში ორი წლის წინ საზაფხულო სკოლა. ეს ძალიან საინტერესო ჩაიარა ზოგიერთ მონაცემებს ხედა. Let's see if I can do that. And I want to once more to introduce Simeon Jankov, which is a big friend of our university. Actually, I want to open a secret so that when he was working for World Bank, we were discussing that maybe he can come to Georgia and take my today position in the university to coordinate the development of the university and the strategic development of the university and the study here. But he decided to become Vice Prime Minister of Bulgaria. So I can say that Vice Prime Minister of Bulgaria is better than Chairman of Board of Trustees of Tbilisi University, but I'm not sure there's many other jobs which are better. Okay? So, and floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Indeed, I was here, I think the first time that we were opening this building, or it was just opened for a summer series that I was also presenting, and it was in fact in this very lecture hall, that we had met this summer. And then we discussed the topic of, among other topics, we discussed the topic of how crisis started, the economic crisis, where it started, what was the reason for the economic and financial crisis, and so on. So I thought that today I'll discuss not the origin of the crisis, but what we are starting to learn at the end of this economic crisis, so that first other economic crises don't come too often, although there will be periodically financial and economic crisis. And I'll in particular speak about the economic models that either have shown not to work during this crisis and therefore we should not repeat them, and also the economic models that may work, or at least some ingredients of economic models. So I'll get to the point of what doesn't work and then some ingredients of what works, and maybe then we can discuss what you see developing as an economic model in Georgia. I can talk about Bulgaria and some other countries in the European Union, so we can have a discussion. We are now into the third year of the economic crisis. Much of the world has recovered from it. Europe is actually the last continent, so to speak, the last group of countries that hasn't yet, as a group of countries, recovered from the crisis. In other words, Asia recovered fairly quickly. Some countries like China never went into a big crisis. Latin America recovered already late last year. The US sort of recovered late last year. Now has some problems, but still has some economic growth. And it's only Europe that some countries have recovered and then actually fell back into some sort of recessions. Other countries have not yet recovered, have negative economic growth for a third year running. And some countries have gotten into deep crisis, like Greece, like Romania. Ireland lately is a country like that, and so on. So what have we learned from this crisis? I'll mainly talk about Europe, since this is where most of my work is now, and to some extent the US. Basically the developed economies, and what have we learned from how they go. Generally, we've learned, and this one big lessons for public finance, but in general for politicians as well, that at least now there is a new trend all over the world, not only in Europe, lately in the United States, but also in many of the developing countries, that in public finances, it's no longer tolerated to have large deficits over, let's say, medium term, over the medium term of a number of years. In other words, while in the past, both in economic theory, so to speak, as well as in practice, there were many countries that could reasonably say, since we're growing, we can afford having deficits over a number of years, and as long as this is fitting into the economic growth model where there is large investment, therefore we will be successful. And this crisis has brought essentially zero tolerance to having high deficits. We've seen this at the extreme in Europe, where finance ministers, general politicians, especially the Germans, Chancellor Merkel, are making the point that we don't want to bail out any other countries, any more countries, so we want to impose very strict rules for not having deficits in the future. Germany, in fact, proposed and adopted a change in the constitution, in the German constitution, that basically says by the starting from the year 2015, Germany cannot have deficits higher than 1% of GDP. You basically have to change the constitution in order to have a large deficit, which is extremely difficult. In other words, it's not going to happen. This idea is discussed in several other countries, including in the Netherlands, including actually in Bulgaria. The idea of just constitutionally disallowing governments in the future to have either to have deficits at all or to have deficits above a certain point. The financial meltdown in Greece, to a large extent, is that problem. The Greek government was spending over many years more than they're collecting in revenues, somehow with the idea that the Greek economy over time will grow faster and will be able to bridge that public financing gap. The economic crisis hit. What was a chronic deficit turned into a basically insurmountable issue for public finances in Greece, and essentially Greece became insolvent. There was a different way to discuss what happened in Greece, how it was assisted by the European Union, but basically without the help of the European Union, Greece would not have been able to continue existing in terms of its public finances. So the crisis in Greece, in other words, is a public finance crisis, and specifically large chronic deficits turning into a very large share of public debt to GDP that wouldn't have been maintained over time after the crisis, and therefore all the measures that Greece needs to take. To some degree, there are a number of other countries in Europe that, not to that extreme, but also had the same problem, and hence the intolerance that this generated first in Europe. Again, Chancellor Merkel probably was the most prominent critic of that, and the Germans. But also just earlier this week, we saw the same type of measures being taken by the Obama administration in the US, which until now was taking the view that as long as we can print dollars, and as long as the rest of the world is silly enough to buy dollars from us, in terms of treasuries, not dollars, then we are fine. And it's only this week that basically the deficit commission, as it is called in the US, came and said we cannot sustain, even a country like the US cannot sustain this large budget deficits, therefore we're freezing public salaries, we're reducing by 20% the number of the spending, including of the White House and Congress. Let's see how popular that is once it goes to Congress. And in a number of other areas, reducing public spending by 15%, 10%, and so on. Very drastic measures. Let's see whether they go through Congress and the Senate. But even the US, the largest economy in the world, already has fallen into this new feature of economic modeling, if I could say so, that you cannot run a large public deficit, no matter how large your economy is and the prospects in front of your economy. So then if you go back to economic models and think, okay, so even for countries that think that they have bright economic future, in other words, investment today will be bringing a lot of economic growth and profits, if you like, in the future. But you cannot finance it or leverage, if you like, future earnings, public earnings, with money now. So perhaps we can do it with private money, essentially. So not the government getting into large deficits, but the corporate sector of a particular country getting into a larger deficit, again with the idea that they invest now and in the future they'll be able to not only repay these debts, but do even better than that. So that for a while seemed like it may be the next financing part of an economic model, except for Ireland, which in the last month, let's say, has had trouble and was the second country after Greece that had to be essentially helped by the European Union. Ireland, unlike Greece, doesn't have big problems in the public financing. It has some problems, but the debt to GDP is nowhere near the Greek one. And while it has one of the larger deficits in the European Union, the problem in Ireland is not the public financing so much as the private financing and actually the bank financing. So if you include the fact that by now every Irish bank is partly or fully nationalized, if you calculate in that way the cost to the government of essentially nationalizing the whole banking sector, just for this year, for 2010, the deficit of Ireland, officially if it's calculated so far, is about a third of the GDP, so about 32-33%. But even that sort of calculated in a way to hide some of the true costs of the bank bailouts by the government. In other words, if you calculate the true cost, it would turn out that essentially 60-70% of the GDP of Ireland just for this year has gone into financing the bankrupt banking sector. Basically, has gone into not allowing the bankruptcy of the financial sector in Ireland. Ireland is different from Greece because there the private banking sector was the one that expanded very rapidly, expanded credit mostly for real estate, for other things as well, but for real estate. And once the crisis came, they could not sustain it, so suddenly bank credit to GDP became something like 800%. So the bank credit extended to corporate Ireland was 8 times what the GDP of the country was, which clearly cannot be sustained over a period of time. So in other words, from Ireland we can learn that both the markets as well as international politics would not tolerate countries that finance themselves with large bank spending or private sector credit. So that kind of financing goes out too. And there have been, incidentally, other countries in the past, and even now, to varying degrees, that were financing themselves with a lot of credit for the banking sector. Hungary actually is another country like that. It has some other features, but Hungary also had a very large growth of banking credit, and incidentally it's also one of the countries in Europe that among the first to get into a crisis situation, that now after Ireland has been evaluated badly by the international analysts. Now Hungary in the last 2 or 3 days is having a second wave, if you like, of problems in international markets, with some discussion of downgrading it below investment grade and so on. So the point is that what Ireland and Hungary actually as well point out to is that at least in the next decade or so, the world is not going to tolerate both private markets as well as the international supervisors, if you like, are not going to tolerate growth which is based on large, even private bank credit. So then, in terms of financing, what remains? Well, essentially 2 things remain. That somehow companies in a particular country need to be so flexible and develop such good business plans that they can finance themselves out of their earnings. In other words, whatever you produce, roughly speaking, that's what the profit that you produce and you manage to invest, that's how you'll be investing, which is called organic growth, if you like, in corporate financing. which is fine for the large majority of projects, but it's very difficult with organic growth or through organic growth to develop very large new projects. For that you need some sort of large project financing. I'm not saying that that's going to disappear now from the banking sector, but it's certainly not going to be tolerated through bank credit the way that it has been tolerated until now. So then the only significant remaining piece of financing, that is foreign direct investment. So large companies, relatively speaking, large companies from abroad come to smaller countries. Don't have to be small countries, can also be large countries, but given between Georgia, if you're picturing, visualizing how this growth can be. So large foreign companies coming, setting up shop here, building factories or production facilities from scratch, and since they have their own internal financing, they are able to develop the large projects that otherwise you would not be able to develop either through public money, through private banking money, and through the money that's accumulated in Georgian businesses. And these are, in fact, from a corporate finance perspective, these are basically all the possible ways in which you can finance growth. Two of them now, I would argue, are not going to be in fashion for some years to come, because this crisis has shown that they're not sustainable. That neither the governments can, once you get into this spiral of spending more that you can earn, neither the governments can help themselves then get disciplined and reduce the deficits, nor the banking sector seems to be able, this crisis has shown, to discipline itself. So essentially it remains to the companies themselves, either the local companies to invest shrewdly their own resources for expansion, or for governments to attract large foreign direct investments to come to their countries and to develop these new larger facilities. On the financing side, I would say this is what so far at least we've learned from this economic crisis, at least as regards the small open economies like Georgia, like Bulgaria, like some of the other most actually European economies. That then brings us to the question, well, what has the Georgian government done so far? Now I'll speak not as a minister in the Bulgarian government, but as an economist who's been following Georgia over some period of time. And what this crisis may teach us to do differently. And I would say that Georgia is one of the few countries, not only in the region, but in Europe overall, that roughly has followed this precise model that remains the only feasible model after the crisis. In other words, the government hasn't run deficits, in fact, with the exception of the last couple of years, where because of the various problems with Russia and the financial crisis, there have been deficits, but before that, that wasn't the case. And over time, there is a clear path of how to reduce the deficit over the next couple of years. Incidentally, Bulgaria has very similar public financing. In other words, we ran until 2008 surpluses, 2009, and this year we have deficits, but they are small by European standards, below 3.5–4%. Next year we're going to a deficit of 2.5%, and then within 2 years, 2.5 years, we should go again into a surplus or into a balanced budget. So unlike many countries, actually the 4 countries in Europe that do not have large deficits are Estonia, Luxembourg, Sweden, and Bulgaria. These are the 4 countries that have deficits below or near the Maastricht criteria, which is a 3% deficit. But the Georgian government of the last few years, I would say, has followed this strategy of no large government money for let's say, suspect projects, and no public expenditure, large public expenditure that then has to be repaid by the next generations. Like Bulgaria, Georgia, many countries in Eastern Europe, the banking sector expanded very abruptly, I would say, very fast in the last few years, with growth sometimes 50%, 60% a year, but because we started from a very low basis, This is certainly the case for Bulgaria. I think this is also the case for Georgia. This expansion did not accumulate before the crisis to enough of a problem so that once the global crisis hit, our economies could not basically go through this. So the banking sector in Bulgaria certainly, and from what I've learned in Georgia, is stable enough, it has been stable enough to be able to pull through the crisis, unlike, as I said, what's happened in Ireland now, but what's happened in a number of other economies. So then what a government in general has to do? Well, it needs to provide the right tax base and administration, public administration, so that the small and medium-sized local companies, Georgian or Bulgarian companies, can do well and have enough money to invest, so not to essentially take all of their money. What does this mean? Low taxes. So the tax burden has to be low to allow the businesses to invest themselves and not to need outside financing. This is true for both Georgia and Bulgaria. Bulgaria, in fact, from January 1st, will have the lowest tax burden on both households and businesses in all of the European Union. Before the crisis started, we were number 2 in terms of household, the personal income tax, and then we're number 7 in terms of business taxes, which is corporate income tax, VAT. Some part of VAT is calculated as indirect tax, their social security tax, and so on. But if Bulgaria didn't have to raise taxes during the crisis, while many other countries had to do that, January 1st, with Slovakia also raising some taxes, Bulgaria will have this honor of having the lowest tax burden in all of the European Union, which we think will fit this new, it's actually all classical neoliberal, if you like, economic model, but after the crisis it's probably becoming the only economic model in terms of financing to run, which is low taxes, so you can have not only low but predictable taxes, so that you know as an investor that taxes are low now and they will be low in the future, so you know that for larger projects that will make returns for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you would be able to invest now and you'll know what you'll get 15, 20 years from now. So that's on the local side. And then to attract this foreign direct investment, actually the low tax burden helps as well, right? Because large businesses are looking for a number of things, how easy it is to deal with the government, low level of corruption, low taxes. Actually, among the first 2 or 3 things that I've seen foreign investors look is what are the taxes that I have to pay. Bulgaria has been over the last 3 or 4 months able to attract some very large investors. For example, Hewlett-Packard about a month ago announced that they're moving their European headquarters to Bulgaria for a number of reasons, skilled engineering labor force and so on, but among other reasons also the fact that the taxes are quite low. Georgia has also done a lot to attract foreign direct investment. If you look historically over the last few years, you would see that GDP per capita is, I think, the highest. Is that the highest GDP per capita in Georgia? Is, I think,
GDP is close to 5.
Is, I think, in terms of per capita, is it the highest in the world for some period, or among the top 2 or 3 countries?
Usually top 10 during 3 years.
Okay, top 10, so very high.
We were first in non-oil countries.
Of course, yes. In non-extractive industry countries, Bulgaria is not quite there, but also has very high foreign direct investment to GDP, given that we don't have also extractive industries, oil and so on. So in that regard, we're very similar to Georgia. So what I'm saying, I'll finish very soon so that we have more time for discussion, is that what in some countries, but actually very few countries around the world, and Bulgaria and Georgia for various reasons have been among them by and large. Estonia is another country like that. Is that the model where you help businesses invest themselves so that they don't need so much external financing, and then try to attract large foreign investors where you cannot invest yourself because the projects are too large. Until I learned 3 years ago was one of the various alternative models of how to run the economy. And in the last 2.5 years, it basically has become the only model, economic model for such countries, simply because the other two major models were, for one reason or another, spurned by large investors themselves, by the analysts, by the rating agencies and so on. And then this has become has started a trend among politicians as well in Europe and now in the United States to say, we are not going to tolerate larger government expenditures than what our revenues are, and we're prepared to even change constitutions to make this the law from now on, because otherwise we just burden future generations and future governments that simply do not have many options except for seeking international help. And a few countries seeking international help, either European or International Monetary Fund and so on, is okay. But if you have many or the majority of countries in a certain bloc that have very large deficit, as is the case now in Western Europe, it becomes very difficult to think of an international scheme that can provide simultaneously help for so many countries. So the hope is that the current crisis is contained. Greece, Ireland are already assisted. We hope that there are not going to be other such cases, although if you follow the international news, you see that there are some concerns about Portugal, some concerns about Spain, lately again new concerns about Hungary. But hopefully with the mechanisms that exist in the European Union of helping countries in the European Union area, this will be somehow will be resolved. Because the issue is, well, if you're not in the European Union, then who is helping you? It becomes even more difficult if you're not in the European Union. And the main message is, in order for you not to need help, you need to run reasonable fiscal financial policies, and this is dependent on companies, low taxes, low tax burden, fight corruption so that large foreign companies can establish shop, and this is essentially the only fiscally responsible way, the only feasible way to run an economy in the next decade or so. I'll stop here to ask for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very, very stimulating, at least for me. I met the international problems also. So please, questions.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on HP case? What was in your opinion, what was the key reasons HP decided to move to Bulgaria?
Yes, certainly. This was just announced about a month ago or so. HP already has Hewlett Packard, which is the largest technological company in the world in terms of turnover and employees. Already has an operation of about 3,000 people in Bulgaria, which however serves mostly, in some operations serves actually the world, but mostly serves Eastern Europe, so to speak. And HP, as part of some takeover just before the financial crisis, has, like many governments, like many companies, has had a drive to reduce costs. And as these drives, in that regard, crises are very helpful because everybody is trying to reduce costs. They came with the idea to have basically in every continent, roughly speaking, or every major business area, to have one headquarters area and not several. In Europe until now, actually, they still have about 8 or 9. So to speak, in 8 or 9 countries, they have some logistics operations, some management operations, production operations, and so on. So the motivation was let's just bring everything together somewhere so that we can run it more efficiently. And then they went to this process. Now we don't know everything about the process, just what they tell us, but they say that we went through this process where we looked at, since HP is a large company, they have operations in nearly every European country. We looked at about 30 European countries, which means nearly everybody. And we looked at a number of things, the main things being these companies, don't talk directly at least about problems with corruption, so I'm sure that that's on their mind, but they don't express it that way. So they say we look at the quality of the labor force, whether we can have enough, in their case, software engineers, Bulgaria happens, as many countries in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, has a pretty good engineering education, university education, and some practice under the Soviet Union. We were assembling computers and such stuff. So products, exactly. So we've had actually a tradition in this area that remains to date in some of the universities. So certainly that was the main driver for them. But the second main driver, they said, is that we have the lowest taxes in Europe. Our corporate income tax is 10%. Dividends tax is 5%. On these measures, we're the lowest in Europe. We still have average European social security taxes, so there is room to improve. But as they calculate, especially this decision was happening throughout this year, 2010. They started from the beginning, where a number of countries were announcing we're raising taxes. In fact, more than half, 2/3 of the European Union this past year, during the year, not this planned process in the annual budgets, had increased corporate taxes, VAT, and so on. And since our government from the beginning was saying we are not going to touch taxes, we're going to reduce government expenditures, we're going to find other sources of financing if need be for a year or two, but we're not going to increase the tax burden. And we're thinking of ways, as in Georgia, I understand that there are some ideas to do that either in the Constitution or otherwise in the recent change of the Constitution, so that in the future we cannot raise taxes very easily, future governments. And that clearly made an impression on HP, so they said, good labor force for our purposes combined with low tax base. Of course, we'd like to have more infrastructure, for example, which is a big focus of this government, road infrastructure. We'd like to have some other things, but basically from all the countries we saw, this is where we like, and they're moving all of their logistics facilities in Europe, all of them. Currently they have 8 places, now they're moving them all. They remain with the research R&D facility in Sweden. Outside of it, everything over the next 2 years is going to move to Bulgaria. And with this kind of things, we hope, but I've seen in my previous work at the World Bank, that once you have one, so to speak, mother company, mothership, move and establish operations in the country, then suddenly you have some smaller related companies also move there. You can have a cluster, not because we have a specific policies of clusters, economic clusters, just because this is how economic life happens. And I want to point out that in this case, and in every other case that people are asking us, there are not tax preferences or any other preferences whatsoever. So this kind of practice that many countries have used in the past of saying, if there is a large investor, particularly high-tech, we are prepared to give them, 0 taxes for 5 years. We're going to build for them warehouses and so on. Nothing like that. So basically, and of course, they ask. They say, well, can you provide some incentives for us? And my response was, well, we have the lowest tax burden in Europe. That's the incentive. And since it's for everybody, not just for you, you know that the next government is not going to change it just because they think, okay, well, this company clearly is in good relation with the previous government, so now let's change the rules on that. It's for everybody, it's transparent, and that worked. And I really think this is the way, at least in the next decade, how governments need to approach international businesses.
Hello, Georg Yaldashvili, Tbilisi University of Economic Relationships. How do you think if there is a danger that such kind of crisis will repeat itself, maybe in a smaller scale, but if it will be in several decades or in the near future?
Now, if you look at economic history, you would see that there is a major economic and financial crisis about every dozen years. So in other words, I can tell you that in the next dozen years, so it's 2010, so around 2022, there's going to be another crisis. We don't know where it's going to start. We don't know where it's going to start with finance, or it's going to start with some economic issues. But history teaches us that every about 12 years there is a major economic crisis around the world. The last one, incidentally, which roughly fits this timing, was in 97-98, the Asia economic crisis, that then spread in various ways, hit Russia, hit Argentina, so hit a few other countries. It was more regional in nature, in other words, a few East Asian countries were hit, but as I said, Russia, Argentina were also not directly, but roughly in the same time frame. This last crisis was significantly deeper, and it's the first global crisis, meaning at the same time every region in the world, with the possible exception of Africa, was hit. That has not happened for about 60 years. So since the end of the Second World War, there has not, so for the last 6 years, there has not been a global crisis. This is the first, and that deep, meaning that nearly in every region, actually in every region, economic growth was negative for at least 1 year, which was last year, 2009. We can think about why this crisis was different from the East Asia crisis, in the 90s, in the 80s there were also large crises, mostly related to oil, 70s as well, in fact. Why this crisis was different, it spread very quickly, and then it affected in a short period of time many countries around the world. At first, when it started, and this was the main focus of my first lecture here about 18 months ago or so, then the Europeans were actually laughing at the US and saying, see, you really, now we can show that the American economic and financial model is wrong, because this is where the crisis started. Just 18 months ago, this was still the prevailing view, that somehow this is a US crisis. Now the US has largely recovered from the crisis, and Europe hasn't overall, so it's turned more as a European crisis, partly because the European economies overall are less flexible, I think. But what happened is that it was a banking crisis. There was some confusion created in London, if you know sort of the origins, that then affected some of the banks in Europe. From that, for a couple of months, trade credit stopped for the whole world, so banks did not know whether to lend money or not for traders, essentially for the large trading companies around the world. So trade stopped for a couple of months, and not only in that way, but this was the major way in which every country in the world was affected. That sort of crisis, I think we've learned enough so that, at least for the financial sector, I doubt that the next crisis will be a financial sector crisis, because we now know how quickly it spread and through which channels, and therefore we can look for this kind of mechanisms in the next decades and prevent it much faster than it was prevented this time. But again, there will be a major crisis every 10 to 12 years. And what do we do? Well, hopefully as economists or as politicians, we can stop that, or at least expand the horizon, so it's not every 10, 12 years, but every 15, 20 years. But in the meantime, the best thing that we can do is exactly, that's why I decided to focus on the economic model. Think of what economic model is best and most crisis devoid. So in other words, how can we avoid crisis? What are the characteristics of a good economic model that avoid crisis? And this is what I just described. Now, a country like Georgia can use this model, a country like Bulgaria can use this model, most countries themselves can use this model. And if they do, I think the possibility of, we are not going to eliminate crisis from happening whatsoever, but they're going not to be global in nature, so we're going to sustain a crisis to maybe a country or a region and not globally. And they're not going to affect some of the economies the way that it was done now. And I think this depends then on every government. It's not something that internationally, although there are some attempts now to agree, at least in Europe, I mentioned this, In fact, I spend a lot of my time lately in meetings with the other finance ministers in Europe to precisely come up with a mechanism that says, look, no country can go beyond 3% deficit. If they go, basically we're going to have penalties and we're going to pay other countries in the union, and there are a variety of other mechanisms that are put in place so that precisely this type of crisis doesn't happen. But crises, like people, are quite creative, so they have other ways to emerge, and we shouldn't worry about not having a crisis. We should worry about limiting it in scope, and of course limiting it in geographical dimension, namely, okay, if the next crisis emerges but it doesn't affect Georgia and it doesn't affect Bulgaria, that already is quite good success. We will be happier than most.
Please.
I have a small question, small stupid question, I would say. How would you assess, I want to go back to the HP case, so how would you assess chances of HP moving their headquarters to Bulgaria if Bulgaria was not a member of European Union?
Well, being member of the European Union certainly helped, but in this particular competition, let's say, that I just described, I mentioned, they said we looked at 30 countries and then we decided on Bulgaria. I know that there are 27 European Union members, so in other words, 26 of these 30 countries were also European Union countries. So in some sense, the competition for this particular job was, I would say, within the parameters that we already in the European Union, and then the things that I just described clearly had a decisive role. Then what would be the effect if we were competing with Bulgaria was competing with some other countries? We probably, my guess is, competing with Turkey as well, because they have large HP operations, but they're not a member of the European Union. So it's a good question to ask. They probably wouldn't answer us. What was your calculation between a country like Bulgaria and a country like Turkey? So I understand sort of where the question is going. My answer would be, in the first instance, you have to have these main economic principles in check, or these competitive advantages. Bulgaria had some of them, and clearly need to develop others, like infrastructure, for example. And then, of course, you can do something about being a member of the European Union, starting with the free trade, expanded free trade agreement, which I understand is already quite well developed. And hopefully in the next few months, by the middle of next year, we'll learn something positive about Georgia's prospects in that regard. That certainly would help. So there needs to be also part of politics, political life. The goal of a government would be to join the good clubs. And in this particular case, yes, the European Union is a good club to join, because you suddenly join a much larger economic area. And being part of it helps. So, in other words, yes, you are right. Bulgaria, being a member of the European Union, probably helped a lot in making this decision, but ultimately it was the decision among many other European Union members, and was weighed in the end, even how that our market is quite small, right? We're one of the smaller markets in the European Union. Clearly what made an impression is if you have sound fiscal policy, which relatively speaking we have, low taxes, that was, I think, the decisive thing, together, of course, with the fact that we have good engineering education. And the role of education, it's sort of silly to discuss the importance of education at a university, especially at a university, private university that is established precisely with the idea to raise the quality of education in the country, in Georgia, in the region. But that's ultimately going to be the most important part, not just for Hewlett-Packard, but for any company that depends on human capital. And that's actually an area where Bulgaria can do a lot more to develop the quality of higher education, and then to some extent the link between higher education and science, applied science, which all of our countries, all countries in the former Soviet bloc, somehow have not yet fully developed, in my view.
Please.
Hello, you have said in your speech that world economic crisis has actually hit to Bulgaria. I want to know how hard did the world economic crisis hit to Bulgaria, and what have you learned from crisis? What were the main weak points of Bulgaria that need to be taken care of to be more resistant to the future crisis that may actually occur?
The biggest weakness, the crisis hit Bulgaria. We had last year our economy shrank by about 5 percentage points, which was the first shrinkage, fall in the economic growth since 97-98, since the previous crisis where Russia was hit, and then Bulgaria at the time was trading a lot with Russia, depended a lot on Russian capital. So we had then negative economic growth, but for a dozen years we haven't had negative economic growth, and last year it was minus 5%, quite painful. What are the lessons for Bulgaria? I think there is one national lesson and one broader lesson which I just described, which I'll say is for everybody. The national lesson is that the country should do everything possible not to have socialist governments in the future, because at the time of the crisis, Bulgaria had a socialist government, and socialists spend a lot more than they should. This is a feature of socialists in the world. So as a result, even though we had Bulgaria for a number of years since the previous crisis in 97-98 had a reasonably strict fiscal policy, just during the crisis when you have to have even more strict fiscal policy, they somehow started spending more than they should have been. So by the time our government came to power, which was at the end of July of last year, the budget was in deficit, and it was just turning into a deficit with a very steep tendency towards large deficit. More prudent government would have realized what this crisis is about. It wasn't any secret, and would have had more prudent fiscal policies, but socialists are not prudent, and that's why one of my main lessons is countries should avoid through elections, of course, having socialists in government. What's interesting actually about this crisis, I'm making a side remark here, is that usually, so far actually without exceptions in the modern history of Europe, whenever there is a financial economic crisis, right-wing governments, conservative governments typically lose elections, and left-wing governments, socialists, social democrats and so on, typically enter into government. In other words, Europe traditionally has moved left during crisis, I guess on the concept that during crisis the poor or some parts of the population suffer more, and therefore we need to help them, and who helps the poor and some of the less privileged parts of the population is left-wing government. This is the first crisis, if you're economic historians, and even if you're not, it's very enlightening to see. This is the first crisis that throughout Europe, conservative governments have been consistently winning elections. So if you just think of what are the elections in the last year. UK, conservative government for the first time in 12 years. Sweden, for the first time ever, a conservative government wins re-election. And it was the first time that they were in government, and it's just unthinkable by Scandinavian standards that they repeat. So conservative government that said we're going to cut taxes, we're going to have less social spending because this is the way to get out of the crisis. So Sweden, Latvia, another country that a conservative government wins the election. Hungary, I mean, just everywhere you look in Bulgaria, of course, everywhere you look in Europe where there were elections over the last year and a half. Merkel in Germany, conservative governments won election. This is the first time that it happens in modern European history, and it goes with this philosophy of the emerging new economic model, which I think I'm giving it the European part, but maybe that's the most important part, is that somehow Europe now has understood that you need to be responsible. You need to have to be conservative in your fiscal policy to promote business activity, entrepreneurship. How do you do this? Through low taxes. How do you get low taxes? Well, you cannot run deficits, because if you run deficits, that means that in the future you're going to have to increase taxes. So actually, the only country where a socialist government has won elections in the last 2 years in Europe is Greece. Not going to comment on that one. And in the broader model, what we learn is what we just described. That somehow the financial part of the emerging economic model, which is not new, it's one of the alternatives that have always been around. But now I think at least for a decade, people forget, governments forget, financial analysts forget even faster. But at least for a few years in the next decade, I predict people would not be going to the alternative economic models because they'll be afraid of doing it.
If I can add about Greece, actually in Greece, formally the conservatives ruled in the socialist region, but we looked at what was that conservatives. That conservatives has spent in Spain, they behave like socialists. So the voters vote for a new party, and this party, which is socialist, by definition, initial definition, they behave like conservatives now. So actually that's the interesting point of view. Please.
Hello. How deep and important is the role of Chinese capital in the investment process as a helpful instrument to cover the crisis? Generally for what?
I was recently about a month ago, actually went to China as part of the World Bank. I frequently visit China, but for the first time as a part of the Bulgarian government, with the main goal to attract Chinese investment. China is very developing, and it's clearly going to be the world's largest economy in the next couple of decades. The rate of growth there quite amazing, given that it has very large population, rapidly improving literacy rates and education both at home, and a lot of Chinese students go abroad then come back. The growth prospects of China and Chinese companies are huge. By now, of course, in many of the sectors that we can think of, China is already has the largest producers. To me, probably the most indicative is not some of the high-tech sectors that we know in terms of toys and so on, but wine. I don't know how much you know about wine production around the world, but there hasn't been a tradition of winemaking in Asia. In Asia, traditionally they drink beer, some strong liquors like sake and so on. But about a decade ago or so, I happen to have been somewhat involved in this process. China decided that they want to have a wine industry. Why? It's kind of a different story. Not only they decided, but they said we're going to have among the biggest companies producing wine in the world. They established two companies. One is called Great Wall, as are many of the companies China has, and the other one is called Dynasty. And these two companies were established just a decade ago or so. Now they produce in the top 5 companies in the world in terms of producing wine. In fact, one of them this year will be #1, the other one will be #3 in the world. So in terms of quantity of wine, I am speaking about quantity, number of bottles, they already are in the top 5 in the world. Quality can be improved, of course. They've worked with Australian vintners, with French vintners, and so on. But the point I'm trying to make is that in an area, in a sector that completely was non-existent in China, within a decade they can blitz, so to speak, and produce very large companies. Start with below average quality of wine, but over time it certainly will be improving. And it's because they have the capital, they have the human resources over time to develop that. Lately, there has been a lot of concern that China's trade surplus is not only large, but increasing in the world. And Chinese Communist Party issued a white paper, which basically is like a research paper, sort of, that says we think it's prudent, we advise Chinese companies to have a strategy towards essentially foreign acquisitions, going abroad and establishing factories there, basically investing abroad, and in that way learning from other technologies and so on. As an economist, I think this is a very clever way basically to say, well, since our trade surplus is large, and especially the US Congress is very upset about this, that China is exporting so much, another way to produce a lot of Chinese goods, but not count as the trade surplus, is if you just establish factories abroad. And then, let's say, if Chinese company establishes a factory in Bulgaria, then the production of this factory becomes Bulgarian. So China is not exporting anymore, Bulgaria is exporting, but in fact it is Chinese investment. So I think this is a very clever strategy to reduce, let's say, tensions in the world economic order, while at the same time having the type of economic expansion that Chinese companies and in general the China economy needs and can sustain. So for that reason this year, and the other reason of course is that China weathered the economic crisis very well. So it's the only large economy that basically was almost unaffected. The economic growth went from 10% to about 7.5%, and now it's back to 10% annually. But we will see, I predict, a lot of Chinese investment trying to find suitable investment opportunities around the world. Lately in Bulgaria we have seen that in a number of sectors, energy, some of the manufacturing sectors, some infrastructure and so on. And I think actually, at least from Bulgarians' perspective, I find this to be very useful, very good, partly for diversification purposes. In the 20 years ago, all of our investment, basically foreign investment, was Soviet or Russian. Now we've diversified a lot into West European investment, and I think it would be good to have some balance, including Chinese investment. But I've seen from my previous work at the World Bank and talking to colleagues, other finance ministers, I see a lot of interest from large Chinese companies in investing everywhere, actually, but particularly in European economies. I think that Georgia can profit from that as well, not just because of the Georgian market, but because of the opportunities, transport corridors, and so on that Georgia provides. But I think we're at the beginning of what could be a few years, maybe a decade, of rapid expansion of Chinese investment in Europe. So far, while we know a lot about Chinese products, they have become a world economic superpower producing, Chinese investors have actually not been prominent in many places in the world. And they have started, in fact, from relatively poor countries, like the countries in Africa. China has very little investment in Europe, relatively speaking, and clearly wants to change that.
Thank you.
University. Mr. Jankov, can you just tell us more about your government spending? I mean, just the percentage of total GDP of your economy. Could you just explain to us which are main companies consisting of this spending, and what's the government strategy or policy, just reducing this number or increasing? What do you think about this? Thanks.
For the 2011 budget, which is next year's budget, which is going to go through second reading, final reading in Parliament this Thursday, so in 2 days. Just like tomorrow morning or tonight I'm going back to Bulgaria to go to Parliament. We have suggested that the share of government expenditure to GDP for 2011 is going to be 35%. In other words, the redistributive role of the government in Bulgaria will be about a third of the economy. If I succeed convincing Parliament, this would be the lowest share of redistributive share in basically modern economic history in Bulgaria. So far it's always been tended to be about 40%, 38, 39, 40, 41%. This is the first time that it's going to be below that, and as I said, certainly the lowest in the last 20 years. In Bulgaria. Why is that the case? Why do I want to do that? Precisely for what we discussed, that in order to encourage business development, but to encourage business development that does not depend on large bank credit as a share of GDP. I want to leave enough money in the hands of both households so that they can buy products, and business. And how do I do this? By lowering the tax burden, which I just told you is in a month's time will be the lowest in Europe. But that also means that the government receives less money, so it has less money to distribute for infrastructure, pensions, education, and so on. And in particular, it turns out that it's around 35%, which of course is a point for huge discussions in Parliament, in the public. What is the right role of government? And since this is a topic that I've been discussing both with research and others for a long time, so this is one of my reasons, in fact, to go back to Bulgaria and work for the government, is my belief that ultimately the government has to pick, cannot do everything, and in fact the government generally is bad at doing many things. It's good to pick a few priorities and just to stick to these priorities. And these priorities actually, both in philosophy and economics, are fairly clearly defined, and you can think of what cannot be done by anybody else but the government, and then leave everything else, every other economic activity, to non-government actors. So one can argue that you cannot have foreign policy without the government, so the government should be involved in foreign policy. You can argue in history that that actually not always been the case, but let's assume that for modern international relations, the government should be involved in foreign policy. It should be involved in security for all citizens, both internal and external security. It should be involved in lawmaking and in setting up the regulatory base for the society to operate. It should be involved probably in some of the very large infrastructure projects where there may not be very easy return for private investor, but even there you can calculate which infrastructure projects can be done by foreign investment. And in that regard, if you follow the European at least news, you'll notice that in the last year or so we've had some big discussions in Bulgaria on the topic of building a second nuclear power station, which was designed in Soviet times even. Then Russia has been quite interested in that project for a long time, and when our government came to power, I said, if this project or any large infrastructure project is profitable, the Russian side, not only the Russian side, the previous socialist government, now opposition, is saying this project is extremely profitable, so it will return multiple times if you build it. And I've made the point, okay, if this is the case, how come there isn't an investor, a private investor that wants to build it? If it's so profitable, that's great. So the government will just give a license to this investor, and they will build it, will regulate them so that it's safe, and everybody will be happy. And this has actually prompted a large discussion in Bulgarian society, because it seems so far at least nobody has thought about this topic of why should the government invest in large infrastructure if it really is so profitable. How come somebody else doesn't build it? So I'm making here the point that even for very large infrastructure projects, it's not obvious, to me at least, that the government should be the main investor. And in fact, I would argue that if there is a case for profit to be made in a large investment, the government, of course, can just tax some of this away through the tax system, but should not be in the business of building this kind of stuff. So gradually, if you go through this process, you quickly discover that actually a well-functioning society can do with some basic functions by the government, by the state, and the rest all can be picked by households, other economic actors. And the role of the government is just to regulate it, to make sure that everybody can participate, so to speak, in this economic activity. Now, this is easier said than done. So you need to go towards this economic model. But at least now, in the last 18 months in government, we've been trying to get to this process, and next budget for the 2011 budget is a big step towards this. Hopefully it passes on Thursday, and then one can build on that for the next few years, so that we can have an even smaller share of government distribution. I think in Georgia it's about 30%, something like that.
Now this year it is 30.5%, but we are putting the threshold of the constitutional law?
So clearly Bulgaria is still by that measure a lot more redistributive, but it would take some years to get to a lower level than 35, 36, and we're already in the European Union, which for many things helps. For some things, however, Europe has additional requirements, additional regulations, and so on some of our markets, and not just Bulgaria, all markets in the European Union. So in that regard, some additional spending probably is necessary just because of being a member of this larger club.
I have a question before I is looking for a question. So I have a question. So it means that that turnaround, let's say, that in the nearest 5 or 10 years we can say that there will be much more privatization, much more private investments in general. So it will be, so how, what will happen with today's model of how Europe is constructed is over-regulated in my understanding. So what do you think about future of Brussels, the economic future of Brussels? So what will happen and how to adapt these changes? Having 20 conservative governments and the socialist government in Brussels looks very unrealistic.
Just last week I was in London meeting with their equivalent of Finance Minister George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and had the opportunity to go on some interviews at CNN, BBC, and so on, and they were not so precise, but basically starting to ask this point, well, are you kind of an outlier in the European Union with your views, what I just described? And you think about it, as Kaka said, of 27 governments in Europe, I think by now 20 or 21 even are conservative governments. So if you sort of draw the line in the parliament and say who is on the left, who is on the right is really dominating. So we have, if you think, we have UK, Germany, France, Italy all being conservative governments. Spain is actually the only significant country that doesn't have a conservative government. Poland has a conservative government. Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. Nearly every country actually in Europe has a conservative government. Yet, as Kaka said, Brussels itself, of course, is more of a set of bureaucratic institutions that don't naturally think in these terms, and of course are much more unwieldy being a large bureaucracy, so may have not yet caught this turn in the political environment in Europe. This is why I think it's very critical and very useful what the Germans are doing, especially Chancellor Merkel, who basically goes out, both in Germany and outside, and says, we are for much stricter rules. We are for governments, for countries who do not obey these rules to be severely penalized and even to go bankrupt, so to speak. So the first idea in Germany, which was not very well received in Brussels, was, well, if some government is imprudent, they should just go bankrupt. And then the second idea was, well, okay, maybe they'll do that, but they lose their vote in the European Union, so they cannot vote if they don't have serious policy. That also didn't quite work out. And then the third one, which is where we are converging to, is we're going to have severe penalties for this kind of stuff. But the fact that a large country, and one of the most respected, if not the most respected politician in Europe, Chancellor Merkel, is talking about this, both in Germany and abroad, means that Brussels is going to be listening, because I doubt that Brussels is going to listen to the Bulgarian finance minister much, or some other smaller countries. But if Germany speaks, I think everybody listens. And I think through that change, but I'm not an optimist that this would happen overnight or in 6 months or in a year, but there is already a discussion of how all of Brussels can change in the direction of more conservative fiscal policy, more sort of flexible regulation and so on. And one of the debates, which is actually now ongoing, and even though it's kind of a side debate, it's very interesting to see how it ends, is the debate on the European Union budget. So
this tax for European Union.
First the tax and then the budget itself. So first there was an idea by a few governments that why don't we have a European-wide tax? So in addition to all the other taxes, so to finance the European institutions basically in a more sustainable manner, let's have on top of all the other taxes a European-wide tax. And that was really soundly rejected by the finance ministers and then heads of state, so that didn't fly. Then we're in the midst of another discussion, which is kind of a small discussion, but to me extremely important, which is that the Commission suggested that the budget for next year, the 2011 budget, should increase by nearly 7%, 6.9% should increase their budget, on top of, you know, the deepest economic crisis in Europe for a long time. So there was some hesitation. I think until now, every time that the Commission has proposed a budget, it's always passed. So this is the first time that a number of governments, 12 heads of governments, and yet the Germans leading the way, said, well, we don't think that you should be spending so much next year. And actually the British, George Osborne, said we, Britain, are not going to contribute to anything but a zero budget. So in other words, no increase whatsoever, which means in real terms actually a reduction in the budget. Then there was some intense negotiations, and then there was compromise between some of the large countries that it should be 2.9%, so not 6.9 but 2.9%. That went to the European Parliament. It's very recent, the last 2 weeks, and that was actually rejected. It didn't work. So currently the European Union does not have a budget for next year. And then after some hesitation and so on, they said the finance ministers, who had nothing else to do, should meet again twice in December, so on the 6th and the 7th, and then again on the 16th of December, and propose to the heads of state what the new budget should be. And if it's not adopted, then the European Commission is not going to have a budget for next year, which means that this year's budget will be divided into 12 parts by months, and they'll be spending as much as they're spending this year, in which way, basically what was required of the Commission by the British government would essentially work, zero growth budget. If that happens, and there I think will be lots of energy spent for that not to happen, but it's already a success that we went from 6.9 to 2.9. If it goes to zero, which is a likely option given the state of the current discussion.
I read somewhere quite recently that about different spendings of European Commission, and one of the most amazing was they subsidized 400,000 euro to dogs fitness center in Hungary to help. The aim was to help the dogs have a more happy life. Yeah. So that's also very important to subsidize not only in one country but all countries that type of fitness centers. Okay, so I think that we exhaust our best, and maybe there is a lot of questions, but I think we can now wrap up our session. And I want to say before, just to inform you that quite soon, in 10th of December, we'll have another that type public lecture. We'll have Steve Hanke, which is the economist from Johns Hopkins University. So we translate his book about currency bonds on Georgian, and to the presentation of the book, and we will publish it, so it's published, and we'll make his lecture about currency bonds and other currency regimes. So 10th of December. Welcome. And thank you, Simeon. It was good, and and we have here book for our guests. It is Misha's Sire. He was first, or he was second? 5 seconds. So we hope
Today, 29th or 30th?